Akimbo and the elephants, and we left off after he had just gotten that piece of ivory from the storage. So this chapter is called The Enemy. I'd like to go to the village, Akimbo told his parents the following morning. Akimbo's father seemed surprised. Why? There's nothing for you to do there. There's Mado. I haven't seen him for a long time. I'd like to see him. Last time I was there, his aunt said that I could stay with them for a few days. His father shrugged his shoulders, looking at Akimbo's mother. If you want to go, I suppose you can, she said. You'll have to walk there, though. It'll take 3 hours, maybe more. And don't be any trouble for Mado's aunt. Again, Akimbo felt bad. He did not like to lie to his parents, but if he told them of his plan, he was sure that they would prevent him from trying it out. And if that happened, then nobody would ever stop the poachers, and the hunting of the elephants would go on and on. As his mother had warned him, the walk was not easy, and carrying a chunk of ivory in a sack over his shoulder, Akimbo found it even more difficult than he had imagined. Every few minutes he had to stop and rest, sliding the sack off his shoulder and waiting for his tired arm muscles to recover. Then he would heave the sack up again and continue his walk, keeping away from the main path to avoid meeting anybody. At last, the village was in sight. Akimbo did not go straight in, but looked around in the bush for a hiding place. Eventually he found an old termite hole. He stuffed the sack in it and placed a few dead branches over the top. It was the perfect place. Once in the village, he went straight to Mado's house. Mado lived with his aunt. She was a nurse and ran the small clinic at the edge of the village. Mado was surprised to see Akimbo, but pleased, and took him in for a cup of water in the kitchen. I need your help, said Akimbo to his friend. I want to find somebody who will buy some ivory from me. Mado's eyes opened wide with surprise. But where did you get it? He stuttered. Did you steal it? Akimbo shook his head. Then, swearing his friend to secrecy, he told him his plan. Mado thought for a while, and then gave his opinion. It won't work, he said flatly. You'll just get into trouble. That's all that will happen. Akimbo shook his head. I'm ready to take that risk. So Mado, rather reluctantly, told Akimbo about a man in the village whom everyone thought was dishonest. If I had stolen something that I wanted to sell, he said, I'd go to him. He's called Matimba, and I can show you where he lives. But I'm not going into his house. You'll have to go in on your own. Matimba was not there the first time that Akimbo went to the house. When he returned an hour later, though, he was told to wait at the back door. After 10 minutes or so, the door opened, and a stout man with a beard looked out. Yes, he said, his voice curt and suspicious. I would like to speak to you, Akimbo said politely. Then speak, snapped Matimba. Akimbo looked over his shoulder. I have something to sell. I thought you might like it. Matimba laughed. You sell something to me? Akimbo ignored his laughter. Yes, here it is. When he saw the ivory tusk sticking out of the top of Akimbo's sack, Matimba stopped laughing. Come inside and bring that with you. Inside the house, Akimbo was told to sit on a chair while Matimba examined the tusk. He looked at it under the light, sniffed it, and rubbed at it with his forefinger. Then he laid it down on a table and stared at Akimbo. Where did you get this? He asked. I found it, said Akimbo. I found a whole lot of tusks and some rhino horns. At the mention of rhino horns, Matimba narrowed his eyes. These horns were much in demand among smugglers, and they could fetch very high prices on the coast. If this boy really has got some, Matimba thought, I could get them off him for next to nothing. Where'd you find them? In a hiding place near a river. I think they must have been hidden there by a poacher who got caught and couldn't come back for them. Matimba nodded. This sort of thing did happen, and now this innocent boy had stumbled across a fortune. He looked at the tusk again. He would give some money on the spot and promise him more if he took him to the rest. You did well to come to me. I can buy these things from you. Akimbo drew in his breath. Now was the time for him to make his demand. "You can have them. I don't want money for them." Matimba was astonished. He looked again at the boy and wondered whether there was something wrong with him. "All I want is to become an elephant hunter. If you let me go off with some poachers to learn how they do it, I'll show you where I have hidden the tusks and horns." Matimba was silent. He stared at Akimbo for some time, wondering whether to trust him. Then his greed got the better of his caution. He granted Akimbo's wish. After all, boys thought poaching was exciting. Well, let him learn. "You may go with my men," he said. Akimbo felt a great surge of excitement. Matimba had said, "my men." He had found the head of a gang of poachers. His plan had worked so far. The next stage was the really dangerous part. We'll read one more chapter. The hunt. Matimba told Akimbo to come back the following night. He was to bring nothing with him and expect to be away for 2 or 3 days. The men would bring the food. "I hope that you're strong enough," he said dubiously, "and I hope your parents won't come looking for you." Akimbo reassured him, but Matimba was no longer paying attention. He had picked up the tusk again and was polishing its surface with a cloth. Akimbo threw a last glance at it before he left the room. He hoped that the loss of the tusk would not be noticed too soon. He would have to own up to taking it, but he wanted to only when his plan had been carried out. If it failed, then he did not look forward to confessing that he had given the tusk to the head of a poaching gang. Matimba was still worried. As they lay side by side on their sleeping mats, Mato told Akimbo, "You're crazy. Go straight home and tell your father what you have done." I'm going to pause for a second, guys. We're not making faces right now or holding stuff up on the screen, okay? Just listening. That's kind of distracting for me while I'm reading, and I want to make sure if you're paying attention, but we're not just here to make faces on the screen, okay? Akimbo told him how they had found the baby elephant waiting for its mother. "We can't let all the elephants of Africa be destroyed. I must do something for them." Mato was silent at the end of Akimbo's story. "All right, I suppose I should say good luck." "Thank you," said Akimbo. Then, feeling tired after the day's long walk, he drifted off to sleep, not hearing the sound of the village dogs barking or the whine of the crickets outside. Mato stayed awake a little longer, worrying about his friend, but at last he too fell asleep. The next day dragged past with a painful slowness. At last, as the sun began to sink below the hills, Akimbo knew that it was time for him to go to Matimba's house. He was the only person there to begin with, but a little while later several men arrived. They looked suspiciously at Akimbo and spoke in lowered voices to Matimba. After that, they appeared to accept Akimbo's presence. There were 5 men in the group. The leader was a short man who walked with a limp. He gave orders to the others, who obeyed him quickly and without question. When the time came to leave, he told Akimbo to walk immediately behind him and not to speak once they set off. "Keep quiet all the time. Do exactly as I tell you, and you'll be all right. Understand?" Akimbo nodded. The other men were ready now, and they slipped away from the village, following a path that led through the thick grass toward the hills in the distance. Over those hills lay the reserve, and deep in the reserve were the forests where the elephants lived. They were on their way. They walked all night. Akimbo was used to walking long distances, but the speed with which the men traveled wore him out. He had to keep up, even though his feet were sore, and he longed to lie down in the grass and go to sleep. By the time the sun rose, they had already crossed into the reserve. Now that it was light, they moved cautiously, keeping to a route that took them through heavy vegetation. Akimbo wondered how long they could keep walking all day as well as all night. When could they sleep? Suddenly, the leader gestured with his hand. The men stopped. "We'll rest here," he said quietly. "Find places to sleep. We'll move again tonight." Akimbo dropped to the ground underneath the cover of a small thorn bush. The ground was hard, but he was so tired that it was more welcome to him than the softest bed. He closed his eyes against the glare of the day and was asleep within seconds. He felt the hand of one of the men on his shoulders. "Time to go," a voice whispered. "We're leaving." Akimbo sat up. His body felt sore from sleeping on the ground, and his throat was parched. One of the men gave him a drink of water from a bottle he was carrying. Then he gave him a large piece of dried meat to eat as they walked. The meat was tough and difficult to chew, but Akimbo gnawed at it hungrily. It was almost dark by the time they set off. They had to travel more slowly now, as the ground was rough and the grass was thick and high. Akimbo had no idea where they were, but he knew that they must be nearing the place where they might expect to find elephants, as he had seen the forests in the distance when they stopped that morning. They disturbed several wild animals as they made their way. An antelope bounded off from a hollow immediately ahead of them, crashing through the undergrowth in panic. Another large animal was disturbed a little later, and they heard it charging away in the night. It could have been a rhinoceros, and this frightened Akimbo because he knew how dangerous rhinos could be. They stopped to rest once or twice, and Akimbo found himself less exhausted than on the previous night. At last, toward dawn, they stopped altogether. They were now in heavily wooded land, and at any point they might see some elephants. Akimbo assumed that now the hunt was on. That morning, after resting for 3 or 4 hours, the group began to move slowly through the clumps of great trees that broke up the plain. One of the men was now acting as a tracker, and he had picked up the signs of elephants. From time to time, he pointed at something on the ground and said something to the man with the limp, who nodded. Suddenly, the tracker stopped. The leader went up to him and crouched beside him. Akimbo and the other men crouched down too, waiting for a sign from the leader. Akimbo saw the elephants at the edge of the trees. They were moving slowly, browsing among the branches of trees with their trunks, pulling down clumps of foliage. His heart stopped for a moment. There was a male elephant among them who had a very large pair of tusks, great white sweeps of ivory. Akimbo knew that the poachers would be bound to go for him. Suddenly, two of the elephants turned to face them. There was a ripple of activity among the others as the two large bulls flapped out their ears and lifted their trunks in the direction of the crouching men. Akimbo realized that the animals had caught their scent and were now alarmed. And if they were alarmed, then they might charge. The leader gestured to one of the other men, who ran up to him with a rifle. The elephant must have seen the movement, because he suddenly moved forward several paces and let out a bellow. Behind him, the other elephants had moved for protection into the shadows of the trees. Akimbo had never seen a charging elephant, and he was not ready for the speed with which it moved. For a few moments, he was frozen in terror, his eyes fixed on the great creature that was charging toward them. Then, quite suddenly, the elephant stopped. For a short while it stood still, its ears out, its body quivering, small eddies of dust around its feet, and then, without warning, it turned aside and moved back toward the herd. As this was happening, the leader was fumbling with the rifle. By the time he had it to his shoulder, the elephants had disappeared into the thickness of the forest. Akimbo felt all the fear drain out of his body. They were safe, and so were the elephants, at least for the time being.